Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to the Compliance Report International Edition, where we have episode 7 of Compliance Man Goes Global. In this episode, we will focus on typical mistakes which compliance officers sometimes do make. For those of our listeners who are not aware of our format, in each podcast we take two typical concepts, or more accurately misconceptions or even conventional wisdom, from the in-house compliance perspective. We check out and see if these concepts work in emerging markets. Tim is a compliance specialist who has worked in emerging markets for 17 years. We divide the roles, with Tim focuses on emerging markets, while I, of course, take the U.S. perspective. One of us will advocate the concept identifying pros. The second will provide arguments, finding cons, and trying to convince the audience that we face a pure myth. As a result, hopefully we will be able to come up with some practical solutions for you. Today we have two myths for you. Number one, there's no practical way to improve your compliance program. This is just a fancy and useless written statement. In corporate practice, it is just unreal. Myth number two, as compliance practitioners, we should draft and exclusively amend compliance programs. The list of policies is well known and exhaustive around things like codes of conduct, gifts, travel, entertainment, charitable donations, facilitation payments, political contributions, and the like. There should be no input from the business side of things. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening to this episode of the Compliance Report International Edition, where we feature episode 7 of Compliance Man Goes Global. Compliance Man Goes Global also includes the Compliance Man Illustrated series created by Tim, which will be a part of the site, podcast site. Finally, Compliance Report International Edition and Compliance Man Goes Global are part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode of the Compliance Report International Edition and Compliance Man Goes Global. Today, with Timur Khasanov-Batirov, we are going to take a look at the issue of mistakes that compliance practitioners sometimes make. So, for those who are new to our series, we explore questions that really focus on the compliance practice in emerging markets. Tim has practiced law and compliance over 17 years in Ukraine, Russia, and other emerging markets, so he brings a unique perspective, certainly outside of my U.S.-centric perspective. We explore this in plain language. We take a couple of different concepts and try to unpack them, once again, in the context of emerging markets. And to add to the podcast, Tim has created the Compliance Man Illustrated series, and we have his illustration for this. So today we're going to check out, like I said, mistakes, and I'm going to start off by posing a question to Tim, and then we're going to get started. So Tim, you're ready to go?
Yes, sir.
Oh, and I probably should have told you that we actually had snow in Houston, Texas last week. So, you guys in Moscow don't have anything on us now.
Well, I don't have any news from Moscow because we have been having snow here for 2 weeks already.
So this is the earliest snowfall in my lifetime in Houston, and it's our first snowfall in 10 years, so we were pretty excited. So,
oh, yeah, I'm also pretty excited, but, I've been pretty excited for 2 weeks already. So.
All right. Well, Tim, let's get started. So myth number one, and so let me just put it to you this way, Tim. There's no practical way to improve your compliance program. That this is just a fancy and useless statement really within your organization. In corporate practice, a compliance program is really unreal. And I think you probably have some pretty strong opinions on this, Tim. So why don't you let us have them?
Yes, Tom, you're absolutely right. I believe it's a huge mistake. Well, as corporate business processes change from time to time, respective adjustments in the policies should be reflected. Thus, if mere fact is ignored, efficiency of compliance controls is getting less, or in the worst case scenario, the control mechanism becomes obsolete. There is another argument which I would like to notice. There is a classical view that internal audit could help in improving the corporate compliance program. I fully share this position. Having said that, traditionally, I would also strongly recommend compliance officer finding common language with business leadership in order to promptly fine-tune controls for existing processes and set new ones for brand new business processes.
So, Tim, before I get to sort of some of the points I wanted to raise, let me go back to your argument number one. Because it seems you are saying that a compliance program, once it's in place, simply having it in place is not good enough. You have to have continual adjustments, continual improvement. You have to continually monitor your program to see where it is because your business might change, your geographic markets might change, the laws in your country might change. One of the only things that I can safely say about business that I've ever seen is it's subject to change. So it seems to me you're saying something a little bit more than having a policy in place. It's actually going far beyond that. Would that be a correct interpretation?
Yes, Tom, that's correct. What we want to avoid is the situation when, you refer to business people and they've been saying, okay, we have a compliance guy. He has something. I think he has a kind of compliance program, and we just adopted that, 3 years ago. So we should be fine. So I think it's a very dangerous position, which you definitely want to avoid.
So, Tim, let me throw out a couple of really supplemental points to what you've raised. So if you take a look at the, here I have to really draw on my U.S. experience and the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program, which was developed by the U.S. Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission. They made it clear that compliance programs are not a check-the-box exercise. And in fact, they specifically say that in the 2012 FCPA guidance. And the key to improvement is monitoring and using that information to avoid a paper program that does not address real risks, or as you pointed out, risks that might change. Having a check-the-box exercise, if you've ever been in front of U.S. regulators, that's really, they can smell that now when someone comes in the room with a check-the-box compliance program. So the second thing, though, is it's more about advanced matters, or if I could put it a little bit differently, the maturity of your compliance program. Because if the first time you have a program, certainly you have to put the basics in place. And I think everyone understands that. I would call it the backbone, the spine, the framework of your compliance program. But from there, it's about operationalization and the measurement of your not only efficiency, but the efficiency of your improvement. And certainly a good dialogue with the business on how to operationalize through implementation, measurement, and making changes to your compliance program is a key to its success. Would you find those 2 points, I would say, are perhaps more U.S.-centric, but do you find that they're true in emerging markets as well, Tim?
Yes, Tom, I think what you've been saying is true for emerging markets as well. You have raised a very good point regarding to paper compliance program. Traditionally, and in compliance community, when we're talking about paper compliance based on the enforcement practice and the FCPA guide, we're kind of referring to the absence of support from business. We're just saying that we're compliance people, we're doing a good job, we've been doing something while nobody is supporting us. And here, I think with what we see now, and here, Tom, I will be thankful for your views. What we want to avoid, of having paper compliance for even compliance practitioners, because almost every big corporation has program already implemented. So I think the risk which we want to avoid is having, the situation when even compliance people are saying, "Oh, it's enough." We're having program. I'm also tired of that. It's too much already. And this is the situation which we want to avoid, because the program has to be improved all the time. It has to be monitored. It could not be like in the steady position. So when you are saying about paper compliance, I think it's a big problem considering the enforcement practice when the regulators are saying we just don't want to have policies, we just want to be sure that people are implementing all these things in real life. So thanks for raising this paper compliance topic, Tom.
So let's turn to myth number 2 because it relates a little bit to myth number 1, Tim. So as compliance practitioners, that means people like you and I, we should draft and amend exclusively compliance policies. Of course, the list of policies is well known, and gifts, codes of ethics, codes of conduct, gift, travel, entertainment, charitable donations, political contributions, facilitation payments, things like that. There's no need for spare time reviewing these beyond the compliance program and really compliance practitioners. So how do you feel about this concept, Tim?
Well, I strongly disagree with this concept. In my view, a red flags approach should be deployed. You should have a set of compliance red flags which are duly allocated among risky business processes. Then you insert compliance controls in the policies which govern those risky processes. More generally, compliance persons should pay attention to the core of the process, not just the formal side. Well, it's not just about technical finding, #compliance, which might not even exist in the corporate jargon or particular organization, but about embedding compliance control in policies which regulate risk areas. Well, and if we remember FCPA guide, for example, what we will see that you could not just have a list, because this doesn't allow you, or it doesn't give you opportunity, or it prevents you from assessing the risks. So in my view, it's not about having a compliance policy list, but about assessing the risk and then inserting right controls in right places. So we have depicted the situation in the attached issue of the Compliance Man Illustrated series. In this picture, Compliance Man just ignored the policies which were not referring to gifts or any other known to compliance people words. So that was a big mistake of Compliance Man, and this is something which we have depicted in our illustrated series. Tom?
So before I get to my points, Tim, let me just follow up on your point, because you raised, at least in America, a very important point, which is the risk assessment. And I want to specifically ask you, does that concept of a company assessing its own risks really translate into emerging markets, or are emerging markets really different?
That's a good point, because it's about risk management. Because when we're talking about emerging markets, they are by default are of high FCPA risk. So in these myriads of difficult situations, dilemmas, and risks which are everywhere, it's very important to assess real risks and focus on them and use your resources to mitigate them. And policymaking is one of the instruments to do that. So it's about risk assessment when you've been deploying policies, not about policies for policies as such.
All right, well, let me share a couple of points that I wanted to raise, and then perhaps you might comment on them as well, Tim. Our point number 1 is the list of compliance policies, or at least a more general compliance policy approach, really allows you to have a single point of reference for your employees in various corporate documents. So, for instance, when we talk about gifts, I think it's important that the rules about gifts are stated. They're stated universally across the organization, and most importantly, in my mind, they're administered universally across your organization. And Tim, by that I mean if someone violates your gifts policy in Brazil and they're terminated, you have to do the same. You have to treat people in the United States the same. I'm very passionate about having a universally consistent policy. But if you have a single policy rather than many operational procedures, It can really help, I think, employees to understand it, but can also help with employee morale if they see that everyone's going to be treated the same, even high producers in the United States. Point number 2 is that for organizations where a control environment is really not yet mature, it's advisable to utilize compliance policy approach to form the basis for further enhancements. Another benefit is that you can easily add missing policies, such as know your customer, for instance, or amend the current policies without having the need to change full corporate procedures. And Tim, what I would really like to focus on here is that the written part of your compliance program, the code of conduct, and what we've talked about here today, policies and procedures, that really forms the backbone of your compliance program. And once you have the backbone in place, or perhaps an engineering word, the framework in place, then you can fine-tune your program. If there are problems with gifts giving in certain areas like in East Asia around the Lunar New Year, or the Tet holiday in Vietnam, or the Asian New Year, then you can fine-tune around that, or you can put more compliance resources on that. Here in the United States and certainly in Russia, Christmas is a large gift-giving time. So we might look at gifts around the Christmas time or the Christmas season a little bit more. But I think it's important to have that framework in place. And once you have that framework in place, and I think you said it in our issue number 1, it's the maturity of your compliance program that you can use additional information to move forward on. So do you have any thoughts on my comments, Tim?
I agree with you, Tom, that we should have a framework which traditionally consists of code of ethics and some basic compliance policies as gifts and policies, entertainment, things like that. So I would agree with you that we should have a universal framework which should be applicable everywhere. And definitely, depending on the maturity of the organization, some of the procedures, some aspects could be fine-tuned. For example, mergers and acquisitions. If the company has a procedure about that, we should definitely want to have our compliance controls with regard to due diligence of the target company, for instance. So, but basically, I would say that I fully share your position that the framework which consists of basic compliance policies should exist in organization with any level of maturity in any case. That's true.
So, Tim, I was wondering if you might be able to wrap up with any key takeaways you think our listeners should have from this episode of Compliance Man Goes Global.
For me, it was a very useful conversation, Tom, and I've made some notes for myself based on what you have been saying. So the first thing is about risk assessment. So the key takeaway for me would be the following. No matter what approach organization chooses in policymaking, the implemented set of compliance controls should tackle key risks. So that's my takeaway from our today's conversation, Tom.
Well, fair enough, Tim. That's a great practical tip. This is Tom Fox with my colleague Timur Khasanov-Batirov, and we are here for you. We hope that you will join us for our next episode, which will be episode 8 of Compliance Man Goes Global in the Compliance Report International Edition. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and join us again where we bust some more corporate compliance myths. Tim, thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Compliance Report International Edition, where we had Compliance Man Goes Global, Episode 7. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast. It would help in the rankings and help get the word out about the only compliance podcast which focuses on the international aspects of doing compliance. Also, if you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can email Tim at tkhasanov-batirov, that's TKHASANOVBATIROV @gmail.com. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Compliance Man Goes Global. We will have a special holiday gift giving episode next week, so I hope you will join us again for for another episode of the Compliance Report International Edition, where we focus on Compliance Man Goes Global. The Compliance Report International Edition is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.